Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 26th of November 2023. Just to let you know that the first video was on my other channel due to restrictions and whatnot. Sometimes I have to post them there because YouTube. Anyway, thank you for watching. Let's get straight to the aid segment. I normally call it the military aid, but it generally concerns itself with all types of aid to Ukraine and indeed Russia, and most of it today will be about the grain initiative, the grain for Ukraine conference that's been taking place. But anyway, before we get there, UNICEF has earmarked $450 million for frontline regions. The United Nations Children's Fund plans to allocate $450 million to support frontline communities. Officials announced on November the 25th. Deputy Prime Minister Iryna Vereshchuk met with UNICEF Chief Ted Chaiban in Kyiv to discuss support programs for families near the front lines. Projects include setting up bomb shelters, restoring water supply, and supporting just in general. So that's really good news. Those frontline settlements really need them. Things are tough along the front line, and children are still living in incredibly challenging circumstances. I was talking with Andrew Perpetua on a live stream last night about how they are still evacuating children around the Avdiivka area, the larger Avdiivka area, settlements just behind there, where still a number of children living incredibly harsh conditions. Right, Switzerland will provide Ukraine with an aid package worth 100 million Swiss francs. It's about 103.5 million euros, $130 million. So the Swiss president was over in Kyiv yesterday, so that's no surprise that this has come out then. The country will also provide 10 ambulances and 6 fire trucks to replace damaged ones. Unfortunately, they do get hit. We saw recently an emergency services depot getting struck by the Russians, damaging a whole load of fire engines and whatnot. Just then we're going to go on to talk about more aid from Europe in general. EU pledging 50 million euros to restore Ukrainians' ports. Switzerland will allocate over an additional 103 million, as we just found out, and that was about demining, also in support of grain exports. So Lithuania here contributing 2 million euros to the Grain from Ukraine initiative. So this, is an initiative that we're going to talk a little bit about. So what's going on? A further $100 million has been donated at the summit to help prevent Russia from exacerbating food insecurity. This has been the summit in Ukraine. So on the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor genocide, is very poignantly placed on this day, where the 90th anniversary of Holodomor has been commemorated. Just to let you, I watched a film last night called Mr. Jones about Gareth Jones, a famous, although probably not quite famous enough, Welsh journalist and foreign advisor who found himself in Ukraine in 1934 sort of time, and was the only person to break the news of the Holodomor. In the international press, there was all this move to go along with the Russian Soviet narrative for whatever reason, and I mean, imagine that these days you could have a genocide, a starvation that leads to the death of somewhere between 4 and 10 million people, right? And no one know about it because it's kept so quiet, and Soviet Union was so tight on anyone going in and out, and news getting in and out, and the beginning of that kind of Cold War-esque mentality. And you had this one guy getting in, finding out about it, and getting out. Well, nowadays that would be on social media like that. You just can't keep anything like that quiet. You look at what's going on in Gaza at the moment, and all the footage coming out about that. Well, Gareth Jones was the guy that broke that story, incredible story of his life. Sadly, he was killed in 1935 in China, I think, or was it in Japan, by Chinese bandits or around that neck of the woods. And I think it was the Russians that were responsible for that. It's a kind of bit of revenge. Right, that's not 100% confirmed, but Yeah, interesting. So he's a really interesting story. On if you are British, on BBC iPlayer, that film is there. It's called Mr. Jones. If you're not British, go and find it elsewhere. So Mr. Jones is a pretty good film, giving you a bit of an insight into what went on there. So anyway, on a 90th anniversary of the Holodomor genocide, Ukrainians in 1932-1933, together with international partners, that was what it was, 1932-33, the starvation, a result of Stalin's 5-year plan. Together with international partners, we are talking about how to prevent the Russian Federation from repeating this crime, including on a global scale. The second summit of the Grain from Ukraine initiative, chaired by Zelensky, confirmed that our country is a guarantor of food security. As part of the continuation of the initiative, $100 million was accumulated. At the same time, Ukraine is increasing its export capacity despite the ongoing war. The Danube port cluster demonstrates good results, and the Solidarity Lines initiative have proven to be successful. Also, with the support of partners, it will soon become even safer to use a Ukrainian corridor through the Black Sea. Okay, let's look at a little bit of what's been going on there. Portugal has contributed 5 million euros to the Grain from Ukraine initiative through the World Food Programme. At the Grain from Ukraine summit in Kiev today, Norway announced 250 million Norwegian krona, it's about $23.5 million, to food security and support of Ukrainian farmers. On the 90th anniversary of Holodomor tragedy, we condemn Russia's continued weaponization of food. Absolutely. And Giorgia Meloni giving a speech there, the Premier of Italy. Got, who do we have here? That looks like Croatia. Is that so? The Grain from Ukraine initiative is valued contribution to the global food security response in our collective efforts to find appropriate solutions to this crisis. That is, just find out who this chap is. Minister, Republic of Croatia, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs. By placing our Adriatic ports at Ukraine's disposal, Croatia contributes to the Ukraine solidarity lines. All these kind of entities coming up and supporting Ukraine in this. In fact, when you look down at Exit's threads here, so I interviewed her, remember, on a live recently. Go and check that out. Really fascinating. It's still relevant now, even though it's a few days later. So you've got Portugal, you've got Croatia, you've got Norway, as mentioned, you've got Italy. We've got the Danish Minister of Development and Cooperation and Global Climate Policy addressing this summit and reaffirming Denmark's full support for the initiative for the transition to a more sustainable agricultural system. We've got this is Austrian contribution of 3.8 million euros to ensure global food security. So you've got a lot of nations who haven't been big on helping. Maybe on, not all of them. Denmark is a huge supporter, but some of these nations that haven't been really big on supporting the military effort in Ukraine are here supporting in other ways that it's really important because obviously that is vital for food security on a global basis. But that kind of money will help Ukraine in other ways, right? And it's all about ensuring that Ukraine has a sustainable economic future, whilst also providing food for the world, which allows them to form a platform from which they can operate militarily. So if you don't have all this sitting under that, I said this the other day, you don't have the nation, a functioning nation, and there's no point having an army fighting battles on a front line. What are they fighting for if it's crumbling behind and there's no money to support them? They just, you need that solid foundation. So this is really important. Now, Tim White says speculation today about what vessels Ukraine will be given. Mark 6 patrol boats seems to be a vague consensus. Remember, this is needed because Russia flagrantly commits war crimes by attacking civilian infrastructure and ports and even civilian boats. So, not sure about this. Glasnost Gone says, interesting, at yesterday's Grain from Ukraine Food Summit, President Zelensky said Ukraine would be supplied with vessels to accompany cargo ship convoys from Ukrainian ports to guarantee their safety. I have agreements with several countries about powerful accompaniment of convoys or by Ukrainians, but using foreign equipment, he said. So that would be, I don't know if that's Ukrainian patrol vessels to do the accompanying. One would assume, I don't know whether that would attract Russian attacks rather than, if you let them just go themselves, these civilian vessels, Russia are unlikely to attack them. But if you accompany them with naval vessels, then Russia is likely to want to attack those naval vessels. So I don't, interesting. Ukraine is a major world exporter of grain and has been exporting grain via unilateral corridors through the Black Sea after Russia withdrew in July from the UN brokered deal to allow grain ships through its invasion blockade. Yeah, interesting. I'm going to bring you this news. I don't know if it's news per se, but it's Britain's MOD catching up today on something I and others have highlighted repeatedly: huge uptick in flights to and from Kaliningrad. I reported on that recently, but this is the UK Defence Intelligence Update saying exceptional Russian air transport movements through November 2023 suggest that Russia has likely moved strategic air defence systems from its Baltic coast enclave, actually it's an exclave, of Kaliningrad to backfill recent losses on the Ukraine front. This follows an uptick in losses of SA-21 air defense systems in Russian-occupied Ukraine in late October 2023. So this is things like the S-300 systems, S-400 systems that Ukrainians have lost. The Russians have lost. They are bringing what are essentially I guess, redundant air defense systems in Kaliningrad. You don't really need them. No one's really going to attack Kaliningrad, are they? And bringing them down to Ukraine, well, that shows that Russia are desperate for these systems, that they have been degraded, as the general staff have claimed. As its most westerly outpost and bordered on three sides by NATO member states, Russia sees Kaliningrad as one of its most strategically sensitive regions. The fact that Russian MOD appears willing to accept additional risk here highlights the overstretch the war has caused for some of Russia's key modern capabilities. Agreed, but I think they're making a pretty realistic assumption that no one's actually going to attack Kaliningrad. That's kind of like Cold War thinking. We're kind of beyond that now. Although they might think that such moves would be heightened given the war with Ukraine, highly unlikely. So moving on, tech giant Cisco, big IT company, has built several devices to help Kyiv ward off cyber attacks on a power grid. Quote, fighting the good fight isn't just about cybersecurity, it's about doing the right thing and helping others in the face of adversity. This goes back to what I was saying earlier and what I keep saying, which is Ukraine are the good guys, Russia are the bad guys. It's obvious because everyone thinks so, right? It's only pro-Russians that don't think that. I guess that's obvious, but unless you've got a really faulty moral compass, I don't think it's possible to rationally justify supporting Russia in any way, shape, or form. It's not intuitively justified. Moral intuition won't get you there. It just can't, given what we know has taken place along the front lines, what the Russians have done in terms of war crimes. And here, when you've got Cisco, big corporation, saying, well, fighting the good fight, we are going to help Ukraine because it's morally decent to do so, there's probably going to be strings attached. They'll get some benefit out of it, no doubt, too. But yeah. The Russian government has extended the age limit, as I reported earlier, but it should also go here to 30, effective from January the 1st, 2024. So if you didn't see my first video, moving the age from 27 to 30 for conscription means that people who weren't caught in initial waves of conscription can be caught for another 3 years, and so therefore you are able to conscript more. You can even up the conscription quota and catch more people because you've extended the age. This is something they've done previously in different contexts with regards to mobilization to conscription. They've changed like health limits, they've changed age limits. Is indicative of the desperation that Russia are facing in terms of getting boots on the ground. Right, moving to geopolitical subjects now. Tent camps and temporary accommodation points are set up for newcomers at the border with Finland. The governor of the Murmansk region, Andrei Chibis, said that foreigners heading to Finland make an attempt to break through the Russian border into Finland on November 22nd. Now, we already know that they're only there because the Russians have paid them to go there. This is the project that Russia has put in place that we've seen Belarus do previously. We've seen the Baltics struggle with this. We've seen Poland struggle with this, which is paying essentially illegal immigrants or economic migrants or whatever to go to certain borders and go through the borders to present a challenge to social cohesion, to the stability of that country. It's a very kind of insidious plan of the Russians there? Well, now that Finland has pretty much closed their border, and we're seeing that with a number of the countries in the area, then there is now a build-up of these migrants, and I guess that's a bit of a challenge maybe for Russia, as they can't get through. So, quote, there was already a case of an illegal attempt to break through the border by foreign citizens yesterday. It was obviously stopped, Chibis said, without giving further details of the incident. Nonetheless, he emphasized that, quote, the situation today is absolutely controlled. The governor also added that the regional authorities are taking all the necessary measures to ensure law and order in the region, regardless of those, quote, unfriendly and provocative actions that Finland allows itself, closing checkpoints. Earlier, Chibis said that the Murmansk region has been put on high alert due to Finland's closure of almost all border crossings with Russia. The governor emphasized that this decision would lead to the fact that, quote, the number of foreign citizens wishing to enter the NATO country through our territory will probably multiply in the region. I suppose you'd ask himself, why do they want to go to a NATO country and not stay in Russia? Maybe that's a question he should be asking himself. In this regard, the Russian authorities decided to open 3 temporary accommodation centres for refugees. Okay, now, Latvia has declared its readiness to join negotiations to unblock the border of Ukraine and Poland. So we've seen these Polish truckers block the border checkpoints due to some issues with, trade into Ukraine and truckers and whatnot. Although it does appear that there's a big connection to that protest by the Polish truckers and a connection with them and Russia. And so it seems to be Russia stoking these divisions. But anyway, this has been stated in the press service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. Poland and Latvia also discuss a future decision of the Council of the EU regarding the start of negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the EU. Now, talking of that Polish-Ukrainian border crisis, this is Goncharenko, Oleksiy Goncharenko, who's a Ukrainian member of parliament, saying, quote, I believe that Ukrainian authorities should do everything possible to unblock the border. Yes, it's cost an awful lot in terms of trade, 400 million euros, I think, or dollars at the last count. And the first thing we have to do is to communicate with the Polish authorities and businesses. We have to sit around the table and talk, looking for a way out of this crisis. Only recently, there was a huge crisis in relations with Poland regarding agriculture. Now we have a problem with Polish carriers. This cannot be allowed. Why the Polish authorities do not implement the decision of Brussels is another story. This is a question between Poland and Brussels. They have a very, very difficult relationship. And this is also an internal issue of the European Union. I believe that the problem will be solved and it will happen soon. I mean, it's probably not helped by the fact that we're in this transition period between governments in Poland, where you had an anti-EU right-wing government called the Justice and Law Party that was still pro-Ukrainian, but very kind of Eurosceptic. And that would not help an issue like this. In fact, I think this was some degrees in the interests of the Justice and Law Party. And now you have what looks like a coalition between Donald Tusk's party and others that are very much pro-European. Now, if they're pro-Brussels, then you might see a solution to this issue. I don't know. Anyway, we shall see. Moving on. Remarkable scenes, according to Tim White here, in Ukraine's parliament today. Jussi Halla-aho, a speaker of Finland's parliament, so the speaker there made a long speech in the Rada, that's the Ukrainian parliament, in Ukrainian as a philologist, so studying the structure of languages. He dedicated his speech to the anniversary of the Holodomor and received numerous standing ovations. Let's just have a little dip into that. It's often little things like...
Пане спікере, народні депутати України.
It's how to make friends and influence people, isn't it? It's a bit, I don't know, can you connect it to neuro-linguistic programming? It's like if you're reflecting the other people, if you are appealing to them by like speaking their language, it makes such a big difference. And if you want to be applauded, speak Ukrainian in the Ukrainian parliament, and they'll love you for it. It's just good to see Finland here looking to cement those relationships in those kind of ways. Whatever. Okay, Kyiv Independent, not whatever. I mean, whatever, Pierce. get on. Kiev Independent reports Ukraine sides with Israel. How will it affect relations with the Arab world and the global south? Okay, this is something I've talked about with you before. I've said, I'm not sure that Ukraine should be so overt in its defense of Israel, because that's a real thorny issue. And actually, that might burn bridges with other nations that are trying to get on their side. Well, actually, Euromaidan Press has a really interesting. No, it's not that one. Where is it? It's this one. Has a really interesting article on this that shows that this is a difficult, I guess, moral. It's a moral dilemma for them in some respects. But Ukraine sides with Israel. How does it affect everyone else? And we know how difficult how difficult it is to morally unpick the events or in Israel and Gaza. It's a right hot mess, and there is moral issue on both sides. I'm not saying it's 50-50, but I've started doing a series. I've kind of stopped doing that series at the moment. It's just so thorny and divisive, and my goodness, people on both sides are shouting at each other in a way that I think is not constructive, but it is really tough. Anyway, this article talks to that and the idea that Ukraine are quite publicly siding with Israel at the moment, and that could be a problem. The Palestinian Authority themselves supported Ukraine's territorial integrity after Russia's occupation of Crimea and of the Donbass in 2014, but it never condemned the full-scale invasion, reportedly because it wants to be on good terms with the Kremlin. While Ukraine recognized Israel's right to sovereignty, it supported the United Nations resolutions condemning Israeli settlements in Palestine and calling for the International Court of Justice to weigh on the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. So in 2016, Volodymyr Yelchenko, Ukraine's UN delegate at the time, compared Israeli settlements in Palestine to Russia's occupation of Crimea in a sense that both violated international law. In July, Israeli ambassador to Ukraine, Michael Brodsky, warned that Ukraine's voting in favor of 90% of anti-Israel resolutions could harm his country's support, highlighting increased tensions between Ukraine and Israel during Russia's full-scale invasion. So Ukraine has been all over the shop in its support or condemnation for Israel, because it's such a fine line. It's so morally difficult that I think they've been recognizing that Israel have been morally problematic in some of their actions, but also they recognize that they need Israel on side for reasons of maybe military aid, because most of Europe and most of and the US are broadly on Israel's side, at least politically speaking. And yeah, there's a bit of tension there. So anyway, to continue, frustrated by Israel's refusal to send military aid or sanction Russia, Kiev in June accused Israel of blatant disregard for moral boundaries and a clear pro-Russian position. But Israel themselves have arguably been pro-Russian, not giving Ukraine the military assistance they thought they could get from Israel. And partly, well, as it says here, Israel explained that it needed to cooperate with Russian forces in Syria and was worried about that Israeli weapons could end up in the hands of its enemies, namely Moscow's ally Iran. So Israel are surrounded by people it sees as kind of enemies or not particularly friendly, and it is obsessed with its own existence, right? For many good reasons or whatever, it recognizes that it needs to spend most of its time making sure it still exists, and that means the things it does are almost always self-serving. So when it attacked drone manufacturing facilities in Iran, and you think that might have been to the benefit of Ukraine, that was the benefit of Ukraine, but kind of accidentally so. Really, it's for Israel, and their positioning on the Ukrainian war the Israeli positioning has been one of what serves us the best. We're not really interested in the moral dimension of the war, and you could say that's the same with everyone, right? But this has meant that Ukraine, in return, has been a little bit like hot and cold with regard to Israel. Well, then Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, and there were all these ideas that Russia was kind of behind Hamas in some ways, either with weapons, training, or whatever. And there's Hezbollah, and etc., etc. And so you had certain Israelis come out. There was that famous rant on Russia Today from an Israeli parliamentarian who just shouted, after we finish with Hamas, we're coming for you, Russia. We know that you're behind this and your war on Israel, on Ukraine. We're in support of Ukraine. We're coming for you. So all these different messaging going on over time that it just is just a big hot mess. The article continues, on a more basic level, Kyiv likely hopes that a better relationship may lead to Israeli weapons. Kyiv's support is also informed by his desire to align with the West. The European Union and US, which send the most weapons, have mostly supported Israel. A few experts said Israeli weapons are wishful thinking. Israel will not arm another country for war while fighting one of its own, and yet reports soon emerged that Israel has sold some of its Barak MX air defense systems to Azerbaijan. Israel and Ukraine are also competing for the US's resources and attention, which means that Israel is likely not a big fan of the White House's idea to combine aid to the two countries in one spending bill, according to Ilya Kusa, an expert of international politics in the Middle East at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. So, yeah, interesting thinking going on. While Kiev is trying to push Israel to support Ukraine, and as De Bendern, so as another expert, put it, to cement the wedge driven between Netanyahu and Putin, Ukraine risks losing an already complicated race to charm the Arab countries in the global south, a collective term for the developing nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Quote, and so now, when we see Israel potentially committing war crimes in Gaza, the accusations of double standards are coming out again, directed towards the West. And, of course, they will put Ukraine within the same basket of countries who only apply humanitarian law when it arranges them, when it benefits them, the Bendern explains. In other words, where people are looking at Israel as what they see as indiscriminately bombing Gaza and killing Palestinian civilians, okay, that you've got the rationale being that, well, literally beneath them are hiding Hamas, so they've got to destroy Hamas, they've got to do that, and they've warned them to get out and all that. Okay, let's put that all to one side. Many people are seeing Israel committing war crimes and then saying, oh, hang on, you're saying Russia committed war crimes against Ukraine, and then you're supporting Israel who are committing war crimes against Gaza. That's double standards. And if Ukraine are supporting Israel, then that's direct double standards of Ukraine, so some people will say. And so this then puts Ukraine in a really difficult position because they want to charm a lot of these countries in the global south that have hitherto been sitting on a fence with regard to support or non-support for Israel. They've been either neutral or slightly, Russia, either slightly on the fence about the Russia-Ukraine war or actively kind of supporting Russia in a kind of anti-West way. So, Ukraine have been wanting to charm these countries, but supporting Israel might not be the best decision to do that. Yet, on the other hand, they would like those weapons from Israel. So this is the dilemma. So anyway, just finally, criticism of Israel so this really plays into this dilemma situation here. Criticism of Israel. So if Ukraine were to criticize Israel for committing war crimes, that might expose Kyiv to accusations of anti-Semitism, amplified by Russian propaganda that tries to paint Ukraine as a neo-Nazi state, according to De Bender. And so, absolutely, if given the division between Russia and Israel at the moment, this is quite interesting because Russia can just play both sides and say, well, if you're going to support Israel, if you're going to go against Israel, Ukraine, then hey, look, you really are anti-Semitic. But if you're going to go with Israel, then Russia can also say, oh, look what you're doing, supporting a nation that is trying to take territory and bomb civilians. And Russia will just say both. So whatever Ukraine do, Russia will be able to criticize it. Not talking about other nations, but Russia itself will just be like wanting to be opportunistic there. So she added that avoiding radical steps in support of any side would be a wise strategy for Ukraine in the short term, which is exactly what I said. I said a couple of weeks ago, Ukraine should just not say anything, or certainly nothing radical. Just go, it's a hot mess. We'll support aid. No, we won't. We'll humanitarian aid, and we're just we're dealing with our own thing over here. So yeah, ask us in a few months' time. She says, and in the long term, I believe that we need to build. I think yes, build a separate foreign policy that would be more autonomous from the Western agenda, including the Middle East. Kusa says, this is someone else actually. It is obvious that we will need partnerships in non-Western regions to deter Russia, and it will be difficult to achieve this by repeating the rhetoric of our Western partners. Interesting. So, in order to succeed in our charm offensive with the global South, we might need to step away from what the rest of the West is saying, because the global South is kind of anti that, and that's how BRICS has been able to gain in momentum and in kind of PR stakes. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that unit, they're attracting people like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, loads of these other nations going, yeah, we'll join you. If Ukraine want to bring those nations on side, they perhaps need to differentiate themselves from Western messaging. Debendern suggested Zelensky can pay more attention to India, one of the few countries of the global south who has firmly sided with Israel after the Hamas attack. While India has extensive economic ties with Russia, which it didn't want to sanction, there is an opportunity for Zelensky to, quote, bring one of the most important countries in the BRICS onto Ukraine's side, she said. And that's an interesting dynamic, because I assume that would be India wanting to do that from their nationalistic government, Modi there being broadly not a big fan of Muslims, even though there's obviously a significant Muslim population in India. But Pakistan was created on the basis of that exile of Muslims to Pakistan from India, and their India positioning themselves with Israel. I don't know, I'm just talking off the top of my head here. It might have something to do with, Israel being a Jewish state and Muslim states all around that. Them, I don't know, but that's an interesting potential for Ukraine to take advantage of India's positioning there. I don't know. It's just a big hot mess, and my advice would be, don't say anything. Just be neutral in terms of not saying anything. Right. Biden has compared Russia's actions in Ukraine to Stalin's Holodomor famine. Biden's come out and excellent this stuff. This is good. He's talking about Holodomor on the genocide commemoration day, which means that Ukraine is at the top of the US agenda, and this is good messaging. The US president said, today Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure is once more being deliberately targeted, this time by Vladimir Putin as part of the drive for conquest and power. The inhumane policies of Biden said in the statement, further citing the inhumane policies of Joseph Stalin that included, quote, death by hunger. He added, Putin is hurting the world's most vulnerable communities for Russia's profit. Strong words there. We also recommit ourselves to preventing suffering, protecting fundamental freedoms, and responding to human rights abuses whenever and wherever they occur. We stand united with Ukraine, said Biden. Excellent stuff. Okay, remaining on American topics, after Thanksgiving, which is now, now is after, the US House and Senate will return to the issue of additional funding for Ukraine and Israel. Good, get it done like now. I know it's Sunday, but do it. House Speaker Mike Johnson said he would support a package vote on funding for Ukraine along with border protection while insisting on separate funding for Israel. Of course he'll support a vote. That doesn't say anything. I'll support a vote, but I'm going to vote against it. Like this human being I don't like at all. Like Mike Johnson is... In fact, anyone who's interested in democracy should not like this guy, because he advocates for a complete biblical theocracy. He's what's called a Christian nationalist. I wrote an article on him recently, and Christian nationalism. Someone said, I think you shouldn't use terms like that. No, it's an actual term. Christian nationalism is a bona fide political term. But he's a Christian nationalist that advocates for a theocracy, which means that he doesn't actually really believe in the Constitution. He believes that the Bible should be the law. If you listen to all of his speaking on the matter, he is essentially anti-Constitution. So if you're a big fan of the American Constitution, which most Americans appear to be, like, you shouldn't be a fan of him. Like, you can be a Bible-believing Christian, but also a democratic, someone who believes in the democratic institutions of the US, such as, the founding principles of the country. Now, if you believe in the latter, then even your former position of being a Bible-believing Christian should lead you to believe this guy isn't really a good example of a great, democratic politician. All that aside, his position on Ukraine is deeply problematic as well. And there's just nothing about Mike Johnson I'm a big fan of, to put it mildly. And they need to sort that out soon. It really, really do. Okay, this is fascism. Right, what is fascism? So Julia Davis, again, I mean, I could do this, what I'm going to say now, every single day, because every single day the propagandists on Russian TV are spouting genocidal rhetoric. This goes back to what I've said this video and the last video, which is who the good guys, who the bad guys. It's pretty obvious. Just watch Russian TV and you get a pretty good idea. So what genocidal rhetoric have we heard in the last 24 hours? Well, just one example out of many. In another chilling moment of Russian state TV, Professor Sergei Luzyanin compares Russia's ongoing slaughter of Ukrainians to, quote, a giant furnace, which burns them up in that fire, and that the, quote, strong and pure steel of a Russian nation is being forged. So the strength of Russia is being forged on in the furnace of dying Ukrainians. As Vlada Knowlton, who's worth following, says, on Russian state TV, Professor Sergei Luzyanin provides one of the most grotesque, fascist, genocidal narratives to describe Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine we've heard thus far. And that's saying a lot because we've heard some sick and twisted narratives on these shows. Well, actually, I would disagree with that. I've heard equally terrible, like justifying burning and drowning Ukrainian children. I mean, that to me was one of the worst ones. Just like, oh my goodness. Anyway, that's enough despicable Russian rhetoric. Thank you very much for your viewership. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, subscribe, and share. And just a big sort of public shout out to who shall I thank? I really appreciate Axel Grammersdorf, Mark Beckson, F. David Davis, Jorg Prinslin, Ales Dobrovich, Gary Knapp, Matt Kirk, and John Eva Helgeson, and Rob Travis Photography. I think I thanked before, but thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate that. Take care. Speak soon.